Welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is Paul Grondahl. I'm the director of the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany, and we are proud to present this ongoing symposium, Telling the Truth 2020. Before I introduce today's guest, former New York Governor and presidential candidate, George E. Pataki, I'd like to remind you that these and all of our programs are archived on our Writers Institute YouTube channel and also can be found on our website, nyswritersinstitute.org. We also provide easy links to order books online of all of our featured authors at our local independent bookstore, Bookhouse of Stuyvesant Plaza. Now, it's a pleasure for me to welcome former Governor George E. Pataki, who served 3 terms as New York's 53rd governor from 1995 through 2006. He's currently senior counsel at the law firm of Norton Rose Fulbright, and he is the founder and chairman of the Pataki Cahill Group, a specialized development firm focusing on opportunities in energy, environmental resiliency, and water resources. He's also the author of the recently published book titled Beyond the Great Divide: How a Nation Became a Neighborhood, with contributor Trey Riddell. Governor Pataki takes readers behind the scenes of the terrible aftermath of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, September 11th, 2001, and how he helped lead the New York State, stricken state, to recovery, and through its resilience, it came back. And this book focuses on the positive ways in which people came together after that terrible 9/11 attack, regardless of generational, ethnic, situational, political, or cultural backgrounds. And in the book, Governor Pataki writes, "On that terrible day, a nation became a neighborhood. All Americans became New Yorkers." Governor Pataki, welcome. Thank you for being part of the Writers Institute program.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm so pleased you're heading up the Writers Institute. It's a great organization. And of course, SUNY Albany is close to both of our hearts. So
exactly.
I'm happy to be on.
Thank you. It's hard to believe almost 20 years ago, the terrorist attacks, and for the moment that you write about, this country came together, and now we have this election. First of all, I want to get your assessment. It seems like we're more divided than ever at this moment. What's your assessment of the election and where we're at right now?
Yeah, Paul, that's exactly why I wrote the book, because one of the positives, there are many negatives, but one of the positives that came out of September 11th was we did become a neighborhood. We all became New Yorkers, and we weren't Republicans or Democrats, North, South, black, white, rich, poor. We were Americans. We'd been attacked, and we were going to come together. And now, as you say, almost 20 years later, we're as divided as we've been in any time in my lifetime, and probably any time since the Civil War. And a country cannot survive like that. So we have to restore the ability to disagree civilly, and more importantly, to try to find common solutions and goals. And I talk about that in the book, as well as what we did to rebuild Ground Zero, something I'm very proud of.
And I was there. We'll talk about that. I remember seeing you at all those press conferences and events in the days after September 11th. But let's start with this current situation of a president who will not concede. I mean, you've been in many races, from mayor of Peekskill to the state legislature. I know you won a lot, but you also lost. When you lose an election, are you supposed to essentially or eventually concede? And what's your position on what President Trump is doing?
You know, of course you concede when you've lost an election. And I think people understood, both parties, after the election day itself, that it was appropriate to take a little time to let things settle down. You know, there were millions of votes that were counted after Election Day. So they were coming in 3, 4, in the case of Pennsylvania, I think 8 days after the election, you could still be counting votes. And so many of the states were closed that it did make sense to take a little time. And it did make sense for the president and his team of lawyers to take a look and see if they had a legitimate chance to challenge some of the ballots that might turn the outcome. But where we are now is quite clear. The president is going to be Joe Biden come January 20th. The President Trump, would need to overturn the results in at least 3 states. That is not going to happen. Was there some fraud? Perhaps enough to overturn the results in those 3 states? No. So clearly no. So it's time for the president to acknowledge that Joe Biden is the president-elect and help in an orderly transition. He had the right to challenge. He had the right to have his lawyers take a look. They haven't come up with anything to justify an ongoing denial of the opportunity for President-elect Biden to have the chance to have the best possible transition.
At what point, if he continues to play this out, perhaps all the way to January 20th, does it become dangerous to democracy and not inviting in the Biden team to having, briefings on international, sensitive, difficult international situations? At what point does it become dangerous?
Well, Paul, first of all, our democracy is going to survive and it's going to thrive. I have a lot of very good friends who were convinced Trump was going to destroy our democracy. And I told them, I have faith in our institutions, in our Congress, in our court system, in our Constitution. And if the battle continues, and I don't believe it should continue, but if it does, the courts will ultimately determine, they will do the right thing. Everyone will follow those court decisions, and we will have an orderly transition on January 20th. So I don't think there's a threat to our democracy. The threat is to President-elect Biden to be able to have the right preparation, the right sources of intelligence that is classified and other things to put together a team that is best able on January 20th to begin the process of running the country. So our democracy will survive, our democracy will thrive. The sooner an orderly transition can begin, the better it will be for the country so that the president-elect will have as much of his team and as much information as he possibly can.
And I want to talk about Rudy Giuliani because, as I said, I was there. I mean, America's mayor, you two worked incredibly well in tandem during those terrible days after the terrorist attacks. He was well regarded, but now he's become this almost caricature, somewhat erratic and unhinged and strange conspiracy theories. And I mean, have you been in touch with him? What's going on with Rudy?
I really haven't. I know he and President Trump are very close friends, and he is fighting very hard for his friend. I just try to see the good in people. And as you mentioned, September 11th, that day, and then the months, literally months and years thereafter, we worked extremely closely together. So he was a good mayor. He was a great partner after September 11th when we had to rebuild New York and restore people's confidence. And that's what I like to focus on.
Have you had any, in recent months or years, any contact with Trump or Giuliani? Have they asked for your advice on anything? Or?
No, they haven't. I was not exactly supportive of President Trump during the course of the primary process. So right. I didn't expect to have a whole lot of ongoing dialogue, nor have I. But in fairness, I think a number of his policies have been very positive. I think his economic policies that drove down unemployment to the lowest rate in our history, particularly for African American and other minorities, and the economic growth we saw and the tax reforms we had, I think those were all very positive. But ultimately, the people judged him. It is time for the transition to begin and for the president to acknowledge that Joe Biden is now the president-elect.
Right. I mean, in your years in Albany, which I was here at the Albany Times-Union, I interviewed you and your wife and your family, and you have a wonderful family, but you were able to reach across the aisles. In particular, one of your great legacies as governor was environmental. All the land you added in the forest preserve and traditionally kind of democratic positions. As a Republican, you were always moderate and willing to work with others. What happened to that whole strain of the Republican Party? Is it possible to do that anymore?
Well, the best way for me to govern, I wanted to do what was right for the people, and that wasn't partisan. It wasn't Republican. It wasn't Democrat. It was what I believed were the right policies. And to get those policies through, my last 6 years, I had 103 Democrats in the state assembly and 47 Republicans. So I needed to develop a bipartisan consensus. And that means you don't always get your own way. It means you don't always get things 100% the way you'd like. But it does mean that if you fight and make the case as to the principles and what they're going to do, that you can get a tremendous amount of accomplished. And on the environment, that's something I've always felt very strongly about, because I went into politics with the idea that you wanted to make things better for the future, for the next generation. And a large part of that, in my mind, was then and is now the environment that we want to leave our children, our grandchildren, future generations, a New York State and a country that has cleaner air, cleaner water, more open space, a better, healthy quality of life, and a natural environment that is thriving as the economics of the state continues to thrive as well. So to me, that should never have been a partisan issue. There are always differences as to how you're going to achieve those goals, but lay out the goals, listen to those who don't agree, and then convince them that your way is the right way.
I think of somebody we both admire as a great political figure, Theodore Roosevelt. I wrote a biography of his early time in Albany. I know you're named one of your sons, Theodore. I know you've read a lot about Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, when he wanted to go into politics, when he came to Albany as just out of, he was actually a Columbia Law School dropout. He'd gone to Harvard. He was kind of trying to find his way. His family looked down on it. They said, "Oh, politics is a dirty, terrible business for a wealthy elite family like the Roosevelts to be involved in." And then he changed their mind, and he became one of our great presidents. But is now politics getting that kind of label again? I mean, who would want to go into politics when you see how ugly and divided it is?
Paul, I think that is a critical question for our future. And you are right that Roosevelt broke the mold when he said, yes, I come from one of the wealthiest families in America, but I'm going to devote my time to public service and to that horrible profession of politics. And he gave every politician a good name because of his integrity, his energy, his commitment to the environment, among other things, and what he was able to accomplish. Now you have to ask yourself, and it's a troubling question. If my kids came to me and said they're thinking of running for public office, what would I tell them? On the one hand, it is still the most honorable and important thing you can do, because it does give you the ability to affect thousands or millions of people's lives in a way that matters. So that has got to be the greatest weight. But on the other hand, politics is so challenged today. And one of the areas that is the biggest challenge is the enormous amount of money in politics. I remember when I ran, you raised your own money in donations, and that was your campaign. Now, in two Senate races, just for example, in South Carolina and Kentucky, the Democrats spent almost $200 million in two Senate races, and they lost them both. But that just gives you an indication that your electoral future is largely out of your hands, because these large money influences can come in and convince an electorate that all the things you did and worked so hard on were meaningless or were wrong. So it's a tough question. Money in politics is very troubling. And the second to me is the media. The media seems to me to no longer be interested in reporting the news. They are interested in advocating for one side or the other in ways that are not really trustworthy, and in ways that simply want to demonize and disqualify people whose philosophy is different. So the answer to the question, would you tell your children or grandchildren you should, if they wanted to run for office, has got to be yes. Because without that, we are limiting the future of this great country. But it's a very hard yes to say. And I think we really have to look at ways to reform structurally the system from where it is today. And I try to outline some of those in the book, Paul, as you know.
Yeah, let's talk about, I mean, again, it was almost 20 years ago, but you have this image of trying to get New Yorkers, and so much of it is psychological with this pandemic, which we'll talk about. I mean, I think this coronavirus pandemic in many ways is initially made me feel like 9/11, but now it's going on so long and so widespread, but trying to get people psychologically prepared. I mean, I remember the first time after I had come home initially after the first week of 9/11, like, do I want to go back into lower Manhattan? Do I want to, you sort of had to psych yourself up. You went on a shopping spree and had pizza with Robert De Niro. This guy would not be around any Republican these days. I mean, he and Trump have been locked in this horrible, bitter feud and things. How were you able to you know, he's a definitely a progressive left Democrat. How were you able to get people like that to go along with you then?
You know, again, it's about solutions. If you try to impose an ideology on someone who disagrees with that ideology, it's not going to work. But when you say, what do you want to do? Do you want to have safer streets? Do you want to empower people who have been left out of the economy with opportunity? Do you want to grow the private sector job market and economic revenues coming into New York? Then you can agree on goals, and then you can argue a little bit about over whether this is the right path or the other is the right path. Right now, what are the common goals that we have for our country? The politicians talk about tactics. They talk about we're going to do this and you're going to do that. They talk about how awful the other side is. Where are they saying, this is my goal as to how we can make New York or America a better place? And there's still a lot of things that have to be done. We need to dramatically improve education in this state. We need to improve healthcare in this state. We need to improve the economic climate in this state. Where are the people laying out a vision as to how they can do that, as opposed to, oh, these people are awful, or those people want to hurt you, or these people dislike you? And we just have to, if we're going to solve the problems of the state and the country, we're going to have to rise above this petty nonsense and move, as I say in the title of the book, move beyond the great divide.
Right.
And understand we're all in this together. I might not disagree with this person. I may even dislike this person. But a year from now, we're still going to be neighbors, or we're still going to be living together. And let's try to figure out how we can work together for the common good. And you know, like with De Niro, I probably on 9 out of 10 political issues disagreed. But we both agreed that it was important to send a message that New York was safe, New York was going to come back, it was okay to go shopping in New York. And we actually had a great time. And I bet he'd still talk to me if I talked to him, because it was about finding common ground. And that's what I talk about in the book.
That's what I feel too. I mean, I don't really understand why people are so ratcheted up now. You talk about how politics has become the new religion. When did it get at such a fever pitch? I don't know why that started. I mean, I think social media plays into it, a big part of it. But what's your feelings? Why has it gotten so overheated in the last few years?
I think social media is part of it, because instead of getting news and listening to both sides, you can just self-segregate into something that reinforces all your worst views about the other side and all how great your side is. And it's more about how awful the other side is than how good your side is. And that seems to be the norm in social media. It's demonizing and disqualifying people and canceling people, as opposed to trying to inform people of knowledge. You know, Paul, I'm a news junkie. I love the news. Where do you get the news today? Right. Almost all the news media is more about advocacy for one side or the other. I just want to find out what happened. I don't need some overpaid expert sitting in a studio telling me what to think or what to conclude. Just tell me what happened. And then I'm capable, I believe, of forming my own conclusion. And we don't have that today. Part of it is the academics. Our universities today are very lopsided to the left, where if I were to go be invited to speak on a lot of college campuses, they wouldn't want me, simply because I was a Republican. You know, I tend to think I have something of value to say after all I've done and been through. But there are many who would say that, oh my God, this guy's a Republican. He's got to be a bigoted, racist, anti-poor, and we should not allow him to speak. So how do you have a democracy when half of the electorate, half of the population is excluded by our elites, like many of our universities? So I think it's incumbent on both sides to stand up for tolerance and to open their minds and understand, maybe I'm not right. And I think that was one of the reasons I was able to govern successfully is, you know, I'd listen to people who disagreed with me, because I knew that the odds of my being right all the time were zero. And occasionally they would be right. And if you didn't listen, you would lose out on having the opportunity to learn where they were saying something that was correct. And that doesn't happen in our academics today. It doesn't happen in our media. And sadly, it doesn't happen in politics enough. And Paul, just let me rant a little bit here.
That's fine.
It's doubly worse with one-party government. Right. When you have one-party government, you not only exclude those who happen to be of the other party from having a part in the dialogue, even though they have a lot of good ideas. Republicans and Democrats both have a lot of good ideas, but you exclude half of it. But then you look to exclude a large part of your own party, where you've right now the Democrats, I think, are facing a real challenge between the left and the liberals. Traditionally, a liberal, center left party. The hard left in the Democratic Party now wants to exclude even many in their own party because they're not hard left enough. And that's not the way America's been. America's always been about, we got a problem, let's figure out how we can solve it. You know, Europe was, I have this ideology, let me impose my ideology and maybe it'll work. That's not America, but that's where too much of the thought processes and the politicians are today. We have to be pragmatic. We have to look at what the problems are and then figure out how best to solve it. And that's how I tried to govern. And as you know, I talk about that in the book as well.
Yeah, what I respected about your years as governor too is sharing the gratitude, or sharing, you know, people getting credit. It seems like certainly Mitch McConnell and the Republicans were dug in on not wanting Obama to get any credit. And I don't know if it's going to swing the other way. I hope Biden seems to be able to reach across the aisle a little bit. But this idea that you can't let the other party or anyone else get credit, even in your own party, only you. And what do you think that's about? Is it just
it's about power, and it's about winning elections. Like an example is we need, and there's bipartisan acknowledgement, we need another economic stimulus package out of Washington to deal with the people who are still unemployed, to deal with those small businesses that can't reopen that are hurting, that to deal with specific industries like theaters that have no revenue and are going to go bankrupt. It could have been done in October, but there's no way Nancy Pelosi was going to allow Donald Trump get credit for a COVID relief bill that happens in October. Hopefully now the election's over. We still have 2 months when Trump is the president. They will sit down and say, okay, it doesn't matter now, the election's over, who's going to get credit? Let's just try to get something done to help the American people. So it's disappointing that it's more about your political power and your personal influence by getting credit than it is about doing what's right for the people. You know, and Paul, one of the reasons I think I was able to govern successfully, I didn't care about who got the credit, and I had a great team. And if you're self-centered, it's all about me, how are you going to have the great team of people around you? They need to know that you respect them and that you're aware of the tremendous contribution they make to a successful government. And you mentioned the Pataki Cahill group. John Cahill was my environmental commissioner and then my chief of staff for 6 years while I was governor. We still work together. And it was that partnership I had with great people on my team that I think allowed us to work across parties and to get a great deal done.
Yeah, I always liked him. I remember how much improvement you did on cleaning up the Hudson River, and I think he was swimming the Hudson River years ago when I interviewed him. He's a great athlete, I know.
Yeah. He still swims in the Hudson. He still does Ironman triathlons, which is complete insanity. His wife and I try to talk him out of it every year, but so far we haven't succeeded. But, you know, I'm proud of what we did with the Hudson. I look out my window and I see the Hudson still. And, you know, it was funny. We wanted GE to do more in Schenectady and more in New York. Right. And I had lunch with Jack Welch, who was the head of GE at the time, and he went nuts over our requiring them to take the PCBs out. And I remember him running these commercials with clamshells dripping mud loaded with pollutants. And this is what Pataki's going to do to the Hudson River. But, you know, and I liked him and he was a great business leader, but ultimately you have to do what's right. And we made GE take the PCBs out of the Hudson. And, you know, I went fishing above the Troy Dam or below, right by the Troy Dam, and it's catch and release because you can't eat the fish yet. Right. Hopefully one of these years I'm going to be able to go there and catch a fish and actually take it home and eat it.
I still remember one of your predecessors, Hugh Carey, held up this glass and said he was going to drink it. He never did, and I'm glad he didn't, because that was PCB laced in those days. But
yeah, he was a good guy, and he became a good friend. Actually, a Democrat who endorsed me.
I liked him. That's what
But I agree, he should not have drunk the PCBs. I'm glad he didn't.
This is what I respected about the two of you. You can come back to Albany and you're still well liked, well greeted, which shows me that you were more statesman than about, beating the other side and things. I mean, I would always see him at the State of the State, and both sides of the aisle would greet him, and the same I see with you. But let's talk about how closely have you followed this current crisis, even longer, more widespread, a global pandemic compared to 9/11. How do you think, first, the federal response, President Trump's, and then Governor Cuomo's response in New York, completely different? One essentially kind of letting free market deal with this virus and assuming it will go away, and really leaning on more of the side of the economy, and Cuomo much more a public health emergency, and certainly causing economic hardship with lockdowns, but a very difficult balance to achieve. Which way did you see it?
Paul, I like to say positive things about people. I know, I watched maybe the first two of President Trump's COVID briefings. I couldn't watch them anymore because it was just really an embarrassment, where instead of trying to explain where we were using the experts and lay out a national approach that would be implemented by the governors, because the governors are the ones who have all the authority in a case like this. We just never heard that. So that's the negative. The positive is Operation Warp Speed. I think that is something, as we're talking, a third company just announced another vaccine with a 90% effective rate.
Right.
This is incredible. Normally a vaccine to get approved takes at least 8 years, and it's maybe 8 months, and we have 3 that are over 90% effective. So it wasn't all negative. That commitment to use the resources of the country, the private sector, the public sector investing literally billions of dollars to incentivize both the research and the manufacturing, and then using the military's logistical capability to be prepared to get those vaccines out. I think that is an enormous accomplishment. And forget who did it. It was done by the federal government, and it's something that we all should look at and say, wow, thank God. And I just hope I don't get sick over the next month so I can get a vaccine at some point when they become available. And I hope within the next month or two it will. With Governor Cuomo, the communication was the exact opposite of President Trump. The communication was very reassuring and not divisive and calming. I have to question a number of the critical decisions. And I have been critical. I was critical at the time, early on, of his decision to require nursing homes to take COVID positive patients. I think that was a catastrophe. That was a catastrophe that you didn't have to be a medical expert to know made no sense. Right. And you contrast it with Florida, where they isolated the most vulnerable in nursing homes and even the elderly, to where we required nursing homes, when they said, we can't deal with this, to take in COVID positive patients. And then the overstressing of the hospitals when the USS Comfort was empty, essentially sitting in New York Harbor. The Javits Center was almost never used, and there were 1,000 COVID beds there. So from a standpoint of communication, I think Governor Cuomo did very well. From the standpoint of the actual policies and the implementation of those policies, I really have grave concerns over the consequences they had to the people of New York. And I'll tell you right now, with the vaccine, if the CDC and the NIH and the companies that produce them are telling the American people these are safe and ready to go, I don't want New York state government saying I can't get it. And the idea that New York has to check over something as important as a vaccine that has been vetted at the federal level, as well as phase 3 trials through the whole health approval system, that to me is just horribly wrong. And I would hope Governor Cuomo would say, okay, assuming they all sign off and allow the vaccine, we're not going to delay it for 1 minute for New Yorkers. because it just doesn't make sense. You know, is health experts who said it's okay to put COVID patients in nursing homes are now going to tell us whether or not we can have a vaccine that the CDC and the NIH have approved? I don't think that makes any sense. So that to me is what is most troubling right now, is when that vaccine is approved federally, we should be first in line and not trying to decide through our own so-called experts whether or not New Yorkers should be allowed to have it.
Would you take the vaccine?
Absolutely.
I would too.
I'd take it today. I mean, there's been enormous progress made in the treatment, the therapeutics for those who have gotten the virus, thank God, but it's still a very, very dangerous disease, probably the most dangerous around right now. So I'd certainly take the vaccine.
Yeah, I would too. But what do you make of, this is almost another reflection of this political divide. I see them come to Albany regularly, the anti-vaxxers. They will not believe the science, no matter how much, not just this vaccine, but they won't. What do you make of that? And how do you convince them otherwise?
You know, it's just, to me, it's really sad, because I'm sure they're well-intentioned, but they're misinformed. And it's one thing to be well-intentioned and to harm yourself, but when you're trying to convince others, particularly the most vulnerable, whether they're children with normal vaccines, or seniors and the elderly and the vulnerable with COVID-19 vaccines, not to use it themselves, regardless of the science, to me, it's just tragic. And, you know, we have free speech. I do not like at all what they're advocating or what they say, but unlike so many, you know, I'm not going to say you're not allowed to say it. What I would say is that they should be drowned out by the voices of reason and science who say this should be done. And, you know, I hope no one doesn't take the COVID-19 vaccine when it is ultimately approved because, oh, this is Trump's vaccine. This is the people's vaccine, developed in a very rapid way by the cooperation of the private sector, the university sector, and government. And that's the best way for things to be done quickly.
So let's talk about some of the sort of takeaways and main themes of your book to get back to that moment when people could come together. I think not only do we have to repair internally our country, our standing in the world has really sunk to, you know, unprecedented lows. People don't really want to work with us right now. How do we get back that sense of not just a neighborhood of New Yorkers, but, you know, for America to have the respect of the world again?
I think America is still respected tremendously today. People, leaders may have those feelings about President Trump or not President Trump, but they still, I think, respect America. And I think you look at the Middle East, this is one area where I think President Trump has been enormously successful, allowing Israel to develop relations with the UAE and with Oman and with Bahrain, and isolating Iran. And I hope that President-elect Biden continues and doesn't go back to the Obama appeasement of Iranian insanity that we saw during that time frame. The president, I think, was right with tariffs on China. I think he correctly pointed out that China is a very real threat, economically, socially, and geopolitically. And I would hope that President-elect Biden would continue those tariff policies. But President Trump has always went way overboard, you know, threatening Europe, threatening Mexico. I'm going to put tariffs on German cars because I'm mad at Germany or something like that. And our relationships with the EU and others are things where I think the president-elect has a real opportunity to help create a stronger sense that we're looking to be partners. We're not looking to be a part. We're looking to be partners as the globe moves forward. But I think there are positives and negatives. The positive is people are questioning free trade globally. And I think President Trump was right that in places in our manufacturing, in our healthcare, we lost jobs that we needed to China because we ignored their playing unfairly under what was so-called free trade. On the other hand, as is always the case, he went too far. And now it's time for us to continue to put those economic pressures on China, rebuild our domestic manufacturing, and particularly when it comes to medical, whether it's masks, drugs, or other strategic things, we should make them here in America. But at the same time, then rebuild our relationship with particularly the EU and Western Europe, who have traditionally been close to the United States and right now do feel that estrangement, I fear.
What did you learn from your time as a presidential candidate? Did it make you want to run from politics? Did it make you feel like you miss being in the game? What did that exercise teach you?
You know, what it taught me is what I really knew is that politics is about timing, and it was the wrong time for me. You know, I should have, if I had been interested in running, I should have run earlier because, you know, at that point there were like 16, 17, 18 candidates, and it seemed to be an open field, but there were two things that changed everything. One was Trump. I never thought he would get the traction and the media attention. It's the analysis was that he got over $1 billion of free media attention, and literally, you go on an interview show, the first thing they'll ask is President Trump or candidate Trump said this. What do you think? And you never had a chance to get your own message across. Trump really preempted the media. And then the second thing was when that first debate, Fox set up the first debate, and they had two tiers. And if you weren't on the first tier, your support just essentially went away. The public was going to watch the main event. The donors were going to give to the candidates in the main event. And, you know, it was all based on your poll at that time and having been out of office a long time. I didn't have the poll numbers of somebody, you know, like Santorum or Huckabee had both run for president 4 years before. They had higher numbers. So what I miss, Paul, is not so much the politics as the ability to impact the national dialogue. I think there are still solutions there. I think there are still things that we could work together on. I don't think the divide between Republicans, Democrats, left, right is hopeless at all. I think Americans still have far more in common that we believe together than things that would drive us apart. I just don't think we've had the leadership over the last, for an extended period of time, that is focused on trying to bridge that divide and bring us together.
Where do you stand on this issue as heating up in congressional hearings in terms of big tech? What is their responsibility for monitoring and having some kind of guidelines for the pipelines? Obviously, there was Russian interference in the 2016 election. That has been documented. There's a question now of how much, you know, propaganda and influence has in play in people's feelings about a lot of things. What do you think should happen to Google, Facebook, Twitter?
I think we should look very seriously at breaking them up. They're monopolies. Google has an essential monopoly on search engines, and they can impose their political views, not necessarily by censoring the other side, but just working the algorithms in such a way where things they agree with get much higher readership than things they disagree with. Twitter is censoring people all over the lot based on their political analysis. Like they censored the New York Post for almost 2 weeks. And that to me was a violation of the goal of America to have people engage in free speech and the exchanging of ideas. So I think Congress rightly is looking at the possibility of applying antitrust laws to those three social media giants. I don't think you want to have government overseeing what they do, you know, so they can't put this on, but they can put that on. I don't trust government to do that, but I do trust a competitive marketplace where you have 3 or 4 competitors who have the ability to do things, and hopefully out of that competition, enough of them will get it right that the American people will be able to see a fair picture of what people think and what is happening.
So the book is titled Beyond the Great Divide, How a Nation Became a Neighborhood. And I remember reading your memoir and meeting your mother and going to your farm when you first ran for governor. And that seems to be so much a part of your character and your being, which comes out, I think, in your leadership of 9/11. What did, you know, growing up with a farming background and your father was a postal carrier like my father was, what did that teach you about, you know, being a centered person throughout all these experiences you've had as a leader?
I'll tell you, you just hit on the two things that had a huge impact on my life. One was the farm. And you grow up with an enormous respect for the outdoors because we were outdoors all the time. And it was something where you appreciated. You didn't just pick something. You planted something knowing that if it was a tree, you wouldn't get anything for 5 years, so you had to take care of it. So you had to have that longer term view of taking care of the earth, and that has affected me profoundly. Plus, I developed this incredible affinity with nature. I love being out there. I love seeing things grow. I love seeing wildlife and plants and all the things that go into our natural environment. And the second thing the farm taught me was the value of work. Because we started working when we were 4 or 5. It probably isn't legal, but I remember we'd start in June picking strawberries, and we were too little. They would not allow us to touch the strawberries. So my cousins and I, the littlest kids, our job was to bring out the empties to the rows where my mother or my father or one of my older cousins or brother were picking, take the full one out carefully and bring them empty ones. So we started working literally from the time we were 4 or 5. So we understood the value of work inherently. And you didn't have to be a brain surgeon or a governor. If you were hoeing a row and did it well, that work was valuable. And then my father being in the post office, I had enormous respect for his intelligence, his integrity, and his work ethic and his commitment to the community. And what it taught me again was that you don't judge a person by their title or their income. You judge a person by their character and their approach to life. I mean, someone who works in a deli and is the best at slicing the salami and making a sandwich, I have more respect for than a lawyer who is highly privileged and goes through the motions and acts in a mediocre fashion. And it gave me understanding that you judge a person by who they are and what they do, not by their title or their net worth. And I'll tell you, my party has had a few candidates who I have real problems with because my view is I gotta be honest, Mitt Romney, I think, is the ultimate person who judges others by their value by their net worth. And I am the exact opposite. You judge a person by who they are, not by their title, not by their profession, not by their money. And that comes from growing up in a diverse community where my father was a mailman, and I knew he was every bit as intelligent and had every bit as good of work ethic and character as as the wealthiest person in our town. And so they really had a profound impact and a positive impact, I like to think, on how I've viewed people in life.
Well, that's great. I've enjoyed this conversation. I hope you have. We miss your calm, rational, reassuring voice in Albany. I'm glad to hear that you're optimistic. And the book, again, is Beyond the Great Divide, How a Nation Became a Neighborhood, talking about leading New York back after the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the parallel with how we can bring our country back right now and from this terrible pandemic and all the political tribalism we face. We appreciate you being part of the conversation. I hope we'll see you in Albany sometime soon.
Well, Paul, thank you. And thank you for what you're doing with the Writers Institute. And, I've tried to avoid Albany, but maybe I'll get back there in the next few months.
Excellent. Thank you.
I always loved it. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.